Mein heutiger Gast ist Ellie Houston. Ellie war in seinem früheren Leben Physiker, nachdem er unter ADHS, saisonaler Depression, chronischer Angst und einer Reihe anderer metabolischer Probleme gelitten hat, führte eine paläo-ketogene Diät und Lebensstiländerungen zu einem Quantensprung in seiner Gesundheit. Der Effekt war so tiefgreifend, dass er gleich mal den Beruf gewechselt hat. Er ist jetzt Metabolic Mental Health Coach, ausgebildet von Precure und Dr. Georgia Eid. 2025 wird er an der Universität Oxford eine Studie leiten, die die ketogene Diät plus einem Online-Programm MetPsy, das er entwickelt hat, für ADHS mit Depressionen testen. Das Gehirn ist das energiehungrigste Organ unseres Körpers. Fast ein Viertel des täglichen Energiebedarfs geht nur auf das Konto unseres Gehirns. Es ist also eigentlich naheliegend, dass ein derart energetisch aufwendiges Organ äußerst empfindlich auf Störungen des Stoffwechsels reagiert. Die Zusammenhänge sind schon lange bekannt. Es gibt eine starke Korrelation zwischen Insulinresistenz und psychiatrischen Erkrankungen, die sich nämlich auch mechanistisch erklären lassen. Wir sprechen über Ellies persönliche Reise und seine wichtigsten Erkenntnisse, die Geburtsstunde einer komplett neuen Fachrichtung, nämlich die Metabolic Psychiatry, und den aktuellen Wissensstand und die Zukunft der ketogenic Metabolic Therapy für psychiatrische Erkrankungen. Individualisierung ist zentral. Es ist wichtig, die individuellen Bedürfnisse und Reaktionen des Körpers bei der Anpassung der ketogenen Ernährung zu berücksichtigen. Nahrungsmittelunverträglichkeiten und Allergien können eine Rolle bei mentalen Gesundheitsproblemen spielen. Wir besprechen das Thema Milchprodukte, ja oder nein. Sollen Milchprodukte ein Teil einer ketogenen Ernährung im Kontext von psychischen Erkrankungen sein? Und wir sprechen selbstverständlich über die KetoFeel Studie. Ellie erklärt, worum es in der Studie gehen wird und wie sie aufgebaut sein wird. Bevor wir beginnen, möchte ich mich bei meinen Sponsoren bedanken, deren Unterstützung es mir ermöglicht, regelmäßig spannende Inhalte für dich zu erarbeiten. Gesichtspflege aus 9 hochwertigen Bioölen ohne jegliche Zusatzstoffe. Genauso wichtig wie die Qualität meiner Lebensmittel ist die Qualität meiner Pflegeprodukte. Jetzt ist es schon schwierig, sich auf Zutatenlisten bei Lebensmitteln halbwegs zurechtzufinden, ohne einen Abschluss in Biochemie haben zu müssen. Aber die Inhaltsstoffe in der Kosmetikindustrie, das ist nochmal eine ganz andere Liga. Genau aus diesem Grund ist es hier so besonders wichtig, Hersteller zu finden, auf die man sich einfach zu 100% verlassen kann. Genau das kann ich bei Prodotti Amano. Prodotti Amano ist ein kleines, feines Startup, die nicht nur laborzertifiziertes Top Extra Virgin Bio Olivenöl produzieren, nein, sie haben jetzt auch ein wirklich einzigartiges Bio Gesichtsöl entwickelt. Einzigartig auch deswegen, weil dieses Bio-Gesichtsöl frei von jeglichen Zusatzstoffen ist. Keine Konservierungsmittel, keine Emulgatoren, keine Weichmacher, keine Duftstoffe, keine Füllstoffe. Auch in der Naturkosmetik ist so ein reines Pflegeprodukt ohne jegliche Zusatzstoffe eine wahre Seltenheit. Neben dem Olivenöl aus eigenem regenerativen Anbau sind unter anderem kostbare Öle wie Bio-Kaktusfeigenkernöl mit dabei, Bio-Granatapfelkernöl, Bio-Traubenkernöl und Bio-Sanddornfruchtfleischöl. Das geniale Bio-Gesichtsöl findest du auf prodottiamano.com und mit dem Rabattcode Julia10 bekommst du 10% Rabatt auf die Bestellung deines Bio-Gesichtsöls. Also, du findest alles unter prodottiamano.com und natürlich hier in den Shownotes noch verlinkt. Hi Ellie, welcome to the Evolution Radio Show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on. It's great to meet you in, on the camera at last, and not just over emails.
Yeah, it's really nice. It's sometimes really fun if you follow someone for a long time. You know, I follow you on Twitter, and then you kind of have the impression of knowing someone, but so it's a little bit surreal sometimes.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I was very much looking forward to our conversation because, yeah, we will talk about mental health and the role of metabolic ketogenic therapy in maybe treatment of mental illness, but especially in for mental health overall. And before we start to get deeper into the topic of mental health or mental illness, maybe you can share your story, where you come from, and why is this a topic you're really passionate about?
Sure, yeah. So I had anxiety and seasonal depression and problems with cognition and mood ever since I was a kid. And, I investigated self-help routes and my doctor was never very helpful. I think thankfully I was never offered an antidepressant. I'm quite glad about that in retrospect. But it was a problem. It impacted my life significantly, and my relationships and my ability to work effectively. And I had a little hospitality background when I left school, worked in restaurants and bars, that kind of thing. And then I went to university and got a physics degree. So after spending a year in China teaching English to high school kids, I came back and worked in the laser industry for a few years with my physics degree. So I was doing kind of engineering and design and build of high-tech lasers. And that was interesting. All through that, I still had, my mental problems coming and going and struggling to make sense of it properly, hiding it really, and sometimes impacting my ability to work effectively. And certainly around that stage, I started to struggle with my weight and I couldn't lose weight easily and I was putting it on very easily. So I was looking around, I felt a bit restless, and I decided to start a PhD in gravitational wave physics in Glasgow University. And it was the strangest coincidence. So I started in late 2013, and my performance for the first couple of years was really not good. And especially in the winter when I had my seasonal depression, but even during the summer by this stage, I had brain fog. It felt like I didn't have proper access to my brain power anymore. And it was distressing and I was anxious a lot. And I started to look into healthier ways of living. And sometimes I would try calorie restriction, and inevitably I would get hungry, and the hunger would win. And I just felt demoralized again. But the reason I say I was lucky was my physics professor at the PhD, Ken Strain, had a few years before, in his early 40s, been told that he would never work again because of ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. And he couldn't leave his bed most of the time. He couldn't walk without collapsing. And he decided to do his own research and found Gary Taub. So yeah, he started a ketogenic diet, and then within 6 months he was running 10Ks again. And so he was able to go back to work and remained a physics professor until he took early retirement recently. But um, I turn up a few years later to start this PhD. I'm underperforming versus my previous, work and degree. And I kind of start hearing him saying things like wheat isn't food, or margarine shouldn't be eaten by anyone, or five a day was invented by a marketing board. And I was thinking, what on earth is this guy talking about? But if he hadn't been a physics professor, I'm not sure I would have listened to him. It sounded so strange compared to mainstream nutrition advice of eat less and move more. And so he said to me, look, if you feel like there's some metabolic problem, maybe, then look at these areas on PubMed and read these papers and look at these blogs like Gary Taubes and Peter Dobromilski at Hyperlipid, and Zero Carb Zen, and Amber O'Hearn, and Georgia Ede, and David Unwin. And so I dived into the literature and read all of this stuff. And I think if you read all of that and don't think keto's worth a try, then you haven't read it properly. And so in March 2016, I started eating a ketogenic diet. And within weeks, I felt completely different. And it was just amazing. I knew that I would be doing this for a long time. And that winter was the first winter I could remember that I didn't get seasonal depression. My mood was fine. And so I was so grateful and amazed. And all I wanted to do was find out why this had worked. So I really dived further into the literature, and I was reading about, on a systems level, which is how kind of most physicists tend to work, why the various systems of the body could have improved in unison with this intervention, and realizing why it's a problem that modern medicine is so niched and siloed into different specialisms, which you can understand why it's complicated. But if there's no joined up thinking, then you're unlikely to get to the root cause. And so Ken, my professor, really became more my nutrition supervisor than my physics supervisor. And in the end, I decided I would leave the PhD to help people like I'd been helped. And so there really wasn't an ecosystem for the mental health side at that time. It was like Georgia Ede, Zero Carb Zen, they were talking about it, but they seemed very fringe still, even though they're very credible. And so I focused on the hospitality background that I'd had. I was selling, pop-up restaurant food, food delivery, sugar-free chocolate and ice cream, that kind of thing. But then around 2020, after a few years of people asking me, how did you do this? What's the science behind it? Can you help me? I wanted to formalize that. And so I decided to get a health coaching qualification. Ended up working with Precure, the New Zealand company, because it's Grant and Louise Schofield who have done some great work already in the low carb space. And I really respect what they do. So I did their training. And then all of a sudden in 2022, the Bazooki Group moves into the space and starts to really create this metabolic mental health ecosystem. And so that's when myself and my co-founder of MetPsy, Dr. Rachel Brown, who's a psychiatrist in the NHS in Edinburgh, decided to start MetPsy. We thought it was a good opportunity and a good time to really take what had happened to me, which was this profound transformational journey, and turn it into something that we hope could help lots of people.
Yeah, really. I think your journey is so impressive and almost unbelievable. If you listen to someone telling a story like you just did, it all sounds, unbelievable, kind of, or like a miracle and stuff. But as you said, there is so much evidence there, and I there was something you said. It's maybe the way physicists think. I don't know. Is there a because there's the engineers and the physicists who have this unique approach to scientific problems, I think, to think about in a systematic level, on a systems level, I want to say. And do you think that's some kind of unique ability?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I think there's some studies that find if you give people more freedom to choose their profession, then the extremes will be wider, right? So, like in Scandinavia, that on average, women tend to be more focused towards people jobs, and men tend to be focused, on average, more towards sort of jobs with things. And so you wonder whether there's these like co-processors in the brain that are tweaked up in a particular way for particular subjects. And I think I do have that a little bit. I was always a little bit strange around, an emotional attachment to numbers and that kind of thing. So I'm quite happy to be a kind of archetypal nerd in that regard. And making sense of the world makes me feel calm in that way. And so I think there is an element of that for sure. And I think physicists tend to take concepts and make sure that it works in the real world. There's
Hmm.
especially experimental physicists, because really physics is theory and experiment, and they're quite different. And there's people paid large sums of money to theorize about the universe, and tenured professors in the best universities in the world getting paid $100,000 a year to theorize about something that is completely untestable. And so it might as well be fan fiction almost, string theory and that kind of thing. And so it's a strange kind of world, but the experimentalists, like I was, take things like pure maths and then see if it maps onto the real world. And so
Hmm.
it's very important that what you see in the lab agrees with the theory. And so that was what shocked me about the nutrition science, was that when they discovered gravitational waves in 2014, they were sure that it was, 1 in a million was the chance that it was a fluke and that it wasn't a real signal. That's how sure they have to be to publish something in physics, in
Hmm.
experimental physics. And I think anyone coming from that world and looking at the nutrition science is kind of like, what on earth is this clown show? But then the more you look into it, the more you realize it's just really difficult to do good studies. You can't control everything like you can in the physics lab. And so I kind of talk about being a recovering physicist sometimes, and not just in terms of recovering my mental health, but also trying to have softer eyes around what makes a successful study, and really honoring clinical practice and anecdotes and those types of signals, and even more alternative therapies.
Hmm.
Because when you dig deeper and deeper in functional medicine, then you get these systems interacting in a way which is kind of chaotic, but you can encourage these kind of virtuous circles to happen so that the systems all start working a little bit better all the time rather than a little bit worse all the time. So things like acupuncture, for example, some people swear by it and say they feel a lot better after it. And I think even though the studies are kind of neutral on that, that doesn't mean that it doesn't work for some people.
Hmm.
And that, there may be something with the lymphatic system, for example, that actually really helps some people with things like acupuncture, and chiropractic and so on. And so I think that the systems level thinking can actually be a kind of blessing and a curse. In one way, it can make you think, well, I can't control all the variables here, therefore it's not worth it. On the other hand, it's allowed me to think, well, you know, to what extent will this system affect the other ones? And therefore, which ones should I focus the most attention on? And I think if I had to choose, it probably would be the gut. And by that, I mean everything from the mouth down to large intestine. And certainly the lymphatic system seems to be super important in terms of ultimately what happens in the brain.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I can't agree more. And I want to make a step back. When you when you started the ketogenic diet, it was March 2016,
Yep.
right? Then at that time there have hasn't been many publications out there, or at least not much information. How did you how did you start? Did you just start, I don't know, right away? Did you have to tweak, and what kind of, there is so many different ways to do a ketogenic diet. What did work for you, or what did you find some elements that didn't work for you?
Yeah. Great question. And it's changed and it continues to change.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite sayings is Heraclitus, a person can try to step in the same river twice, but they're not the same person and it's not the same river. And I think what works for me now or 6 months ago or a year from now are likely to be different. And it's nice to think that you can just set and forget, but very often it needs some kind of vigilance. And I'm sympathetic to people who are not wanting to nerd out on the science of it for their whole lives. They just want to find something that works and then move on with their life and get back into their hobbies and being with their family and friends and stuff. And I totally get that. But I've tinkered a lot with it. And when I first started, it was mainly off the back of Peter Dobromilski's blog, Hyperlipid,
Mm-hmm.
which appealed to me as a physicist because it kind of starts from first principles around mitochondrial health. And so it looks actually, there's a legendary thread called protons, which starts from the potential beginning of life on Earth and how cellular life might have formed in subsea heated vents, which is all described in Nick Lane's book. What's it called again? I need to look it up because it's so good. I think everyone should read that one. It won a prestigious prize. The Vital Question. That's the name of Nick Lane's book, and Power, Sex, and Suicide, which is the one before about mitochondria. I
I
think
know
those
that
two,
one. Yeah.
yeah, those two books were very important for me in conjunction with the protons thread and hyperlipid. And I just thought that after reading that, that saturated fat seems to be so well matched to producing energy in human beings that I was convinced from first principles to give it a try. And so at the time, Peter was quite happy to eat a lot of dairy. And so the kind of version of the diet that I tried first was quite heavy with dairy, particularly butter and ghee and double cream, but also with cheese and yogurt.
Mm.
And I think I have less of a problem with butter, ghee, and double cream than I do with cheese and yogurt. But these days I don't eat any dairy. And so at the time, I decided I would do an elimination diet as well as I could, but that included some dairy. So for a while, all I ate, maybe for a month, all I ate was ghee, egg yolks, double cream, and some sweetener. And I would have breakfast or lunch that would be egg yolks cooked in lots of ghee until I felt full. So that might be eight or 10 egg yolks and sort of swimming in ghee. And then later I would have some ice cream made in a small ice cream maker with egg yolks, double cream, and some sweetener.
Mm-hmm.
And the sweetener would be erythritol or erythritol mixed with stevia. And so that was all I was eating. And my mood was incredible. I felt so good and optimistic and joyful. And you used the word miraculous earlier. And I think that feeling of needing some kind of religious metaphor is something that comes up again and again. People talk about feeling like they're in a state of grace. There's this sense of gratitude, almost like there's light coming out of you, like those sort of religious images. And that was my base. And there was lots of talk around protein restriction, and I played around with having, more lean protein, less lean protein, and ultimately I came away from dairy a few different times. I've been sucked back into eating it. I do think that it has some kind of food addiction component around particularly the casein. I think there's some interesting dynamics there around gut permeability and casomorphins and sort of feeling
Mm.
uh, with satisfied, but in a sort of dumbed down way, so
Mm.
that
Do,
I
do,
could.
do you feel a difference if in, I don't know, mood stability or some other symptom if you include dairy or not, or if
I
you
do.
exclude it? Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
very
Okay.
clear. It's very
Yeah.
clear. And actually, it wasn't until I eliminated even ghee that I noticed, because even with ghee, I can feel a kind of anxiety or dread. And it's much lower than it used to be when I was having processed food and carbs and sugar, but it's still very much there. And it's worse if I have yogurt and
Mm,
cheese when there's
mm,
lots and lots of protein.
yeah. Do you see this also in other, in clients or
Yeah,
as a, yeah?
absolutely. And this is something that I was really kind of excited to see Georgia Ede talking about in her book, because
Mm-hmm.
it's something I've noticed personally and with clients. And unfortunately, anyone who's sort of heard about keto being good for mental health, they might walk into any of the Facebook or Instagram groups that are very large. And one of the main selling points for a lot of people just finding out about keto is that you can eat as much cheese as you like, you can eat as much cream or butter as you like. And yeah, some people seem to do fine with it, but for particularly mental disorders, it seems to be a red flag for a lot of people, even triggering the symptoms quite badly. And so that has to, I think it should come with a warning. And it's a shame because humans are clever. In the last 10,000 years or so, we've gamed the system to domesticate animals so that we can get this reliable source of nutrition and calories. And if you look at Weston Price's work, he found the Swiss and the Maasai tribes people, they were
Mm,
having loads of dairy and they were in the picture of good health. But those people, they're not being born cesarean, they're not being bottle fed, they're not having rounds of antibiotics, they're not growing up in the modern food environment, and with modern pollution wrecking their gut health. And so they're different to us.
yeah.
And I feel disappointed when people like Paul Saladino and others go back to saying, dairy should be something that everyone can enjoy. And I just think, okay, if you're not damaged already.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think it's really insightful and interesting to see that there are certain foods that are per se keto, but it doesn't work for everyone, especially especially for people with mental health issues. Why that is, we don't know exactly. Maybe it's the casein, maybe it's some other stuff in there, we don't know. But I think that's really important. And maybe, you know, some people might start a ketogenic diet and then they don't get the effects they were looking for, and maybe they don't even think about that it might be dairy. Yeah, that they should cut out. Are there any other, there are some keto, I don't know, keto regimes where you also restrict nightshades or nuts. Would you say, is there anything similar to the dairy problem with other foods, or is it really specific to dairy?
Yeah, I think there is. And nightshades, nuts, uh, eggs for some people, certainly foods that are higher in linoleic acid. So that would be conventionally raised chicken and pork, and other birds like duck. Um, the fat in these animals can be high in linoleic acid, just like seed oils. And they can all potentially have different effects and on different systems. So they can all, a lot of these things can be allergens. I mean, eggs are one of the
Mm.
major 14 allergens in the UK and in Europe. And there are cases of people having, lifelong panic attacks or anxiety or depressive feelings who cut out eggs and they go away. you know, this idea that we can have an allergic reaction to something that causes a cascade of um, immuno inflammation molecules to appear that can go into the brain and disrupt our mood
Mm.
is pretty clear. And so I think for a lot of people, eggs are fine, and for some people, they're not. And it's really hard to put a number on it. The only way to do it is to do an elimination diet to find out. And that's why I think something around similar to the lion diet is the ultimate elimination diet, because hardly anyone is allergic to beef and lamb. And the other foods will still be there in a month or two if you want to try it and get a really clean baseline of what works. And so definitely eggs, definitely nightshades. I think nightshades are clearly involved in autoimmune problems in some people through disrupting the gut barrier. And there's some really interesting stuff around that. Like, yeah, you can see that sometimes these foods sort of dysregulate the tight junctions that mean that things that are in the stomach, it's in the small intestine that shouldn't be in the systemic bloodstream get into the systemic bloodstream. And there's also this mechanism where the wrong stuff can get into the lymphatic system via the small intestine and cause knock-on effects around the body. And so nightshades can be a bit of a no-no, especially the way they're kind of processed and concentrated these days. I certainly personally can't really eat tomatoes, and I do notice a signal with aubergines as well. I have a history of autoimmune, and I say to clients that although these are useful keto foods a lot of the time and tasty, that there can be a problem with them, and so they just have to weigh that up. Nuts, I think they can have negative effects on the gut through the anti-nutrients that they contain and through the high levels of linoleic acid. I think putting it through a paleo kind of lens, nuts are quite difficult to get into, and they're only available for certain times of the year, most places. So the idea that we would eat them all year round, I don't believe. I do think, mammals kind of co-evolved with trees to an extent. And I like this idea that in sort of more northern latitudes, that mammals would eat the nuts off the trees at a certain time of year and get fat and survive through winter to do it again next year, so that the trees and the mammals benefited. But that there's some really interesting evidence that might suggest that eating the fat from these nuts actually induces a kind of mammalian hibernation response through a variety of mechanisms, so that actually nuts can and vegetable oils that are higher in these sort of fats, and even olive oil, which seems to have a kind of halo around it a lot of the time, can down-regulate your energy production and put you in a state of semi-hibernation, which could be described as depression, lower energy. That's what a lot of this is about, is maximizing your mitochondrial output and therefore, upping your desire to eat the right foods. So yeah, there's probably a few other foods in there that people have to watch out for, but this is why it can get a little bit demoralizing at the start of the process, where you realize, oh, what, I have to cut that out as well. And not everyone does, but I think that's the truth of it, is unfortunately, there's all of these foods which have been refined and focused and fed to us our whole lives, but that unfortunately we just sometimes can't tolerate.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's really important to talk about it, because it might be the reason someone is not getting the results they're looking for, and then that's why it's so important to point that out. Another aspect which I want to talk about is when we are talking about the ketogenic diet as a therapeutic tool, we of course should measure ketones. So did you when you first started with the ketogenic diet, did you measure your ketones right away? And now that, or in your practice and in your work with your clients, do you see or a certain level you want your clients to be at, or does it matter?
Yeah. At first, I just used the pea strips, and it was just kind of out of interest to see some external confirmation that I was producing ketones. And then the problem with the pea strips is that they reduce in their reading as the body starts to use the ketones and not expel them so much. So they're useful at first and they're cheap, but then they're not very accurate and they get less and less accurate. And I developed more of an intuition around how I felt and what I was eating. And I quite like encouraging clients to do the same. You know, one of my favorite studies is the Clara Davis study, where 100 years ago or so, she took lots of children and including babies who were deficient and gave them the option of eating whole foods that were put in front of them. And the nurse who was there to feed them wasn't allowed to influence them at all. And without fail, the kids healed their own deficiency diseases by eating the foods that had the right nutrition. And I think we are exquisitely designed, if you like, by evolution to understand which foods will do this. And so I can walk around the supermarket and look at foods and think, yeah, I really feel like having that, whether it's liver or shellfish or fish or eggs. And other times I just don't feel like having it. And so I think that is a good way to go about it. And in terms of fat, I think sometimes measuring ketones one way or another can be a good way of encouraging people to eat enough fat, because people at first can't really believe that they're expected to eat how much fat that they can eat, and that they really shock themselves sometimes. You know, clients who sit down for a snack of 3 eggs and end up eating 10, and they're covered in ghee or coconut oil or beef dripping, and they feel amazing, but they couldn't believe that they ate that much given how we're conditioned to think we should eat. And it can be useful, especially at the start of a diet, to work out how many ketones you're producing and how that correlates with your mood. There is no definitive number for which level of ketones correlates with good mood. And there's a couple of reasons for that, I think. One is that it varies from individual to individual anyway, and that depends on age, sex, time of the month, all sorts of, you know, how you slept the night before, how much exercise you've done. It's too complicated to just put in a number to say that this is the therapeutic range. And what's more important is finding out what your therapeutic range is and trying to find that. So whether you're measuring with Ace Track or Keto Mojo or similar, then you may find that you have an ideal therapeutic range of ketones. Some people find they need to include the glucose to make a glucose ketone index, which is just the ratio of the two. And actually, they need to keep their glucose low as well. And it's not necessarily the same thing as just having high ketones. So I think that's a good way to look at it, is that you don't need it. You can be intuitive, but that it can be useful as an external kind of guide. But you can read high ketones because you're fasting, and that can be a big negative for people with mental disorders. So they might think that, oh, I've got high ketones, but I don't feel good. And what we usually find is that people do best when they kind of settle in on maybe 2 meals a day, with the first meal quite early in the day and the second meal before sunset. And so if you do fast and you feel great, brilliant. But a lot of people I know, they try fasting and they hate it. They feel hungry, tired, irritable, even angry. And that's when they reach for foods that they don't want to eat, really. And I think eating earlier in the day and making sure that you're getting enough fat until you really are full is a really good way of not only making sure that you have high ketones, but that you're actually properly nourished. And that people talk about keto being a fasting mimicking diet. Well, actually, I think, you know, fasting is kind of mimicking keto in a way. There isn't really much of a difference as far as I've seen in terms of autophagy or mitogenesis. So people think by fasting they're going to get rid of senescent cells, which I think can be true, but the same thing happens when you're ketogenic. So I think to me there's no downside in making sure that you're eating enough to get the
Mm.
ketones where they need to be, and that it's those two things, that you're properly nourished and that you have enough energy and that the ketones are in therapeutic range.
Great. That's so helpful input. And thanks a lot for that, because I think there is a lot of, I don't know, fuss about fasting, and everyone thinks he or she should fast. And I do see with my clients as well that there are a lot of people who really don't profit from fasting, who shouldn't fast at all, because it might make them more hungry, or they don't get the nutrients in. So there are a lot of downsides to fasting, and I'm glad you mentioned that there's also there might be some downsides for people who are struggling with mental health issues as well with fasting. Um, Time flies by, and I really wanted to talk about your upcoming study, and that's really what we want to also make people aware of. And please tell me more about the study you're planning. How it is going to be set up? How is it structured? What will be the questions you want to be answered with this study? Yeah.
Yeah, really exciting. So we want to recruit in the last quarter of this year nationwide in the UK. And we're looking for people who have an ADHD diagnosis and have depression, whether they have a diagnosis or just the symptoms. And so what we want to do is get between 25 and 50 people in the intervention arm who have these symptoms, and I'll coach them online in groups on using a ketogenic diet for their mental health. And they'll also have access to the MetPsy platform. And we'll do that for 16 weeks, and we'll do measures at the start, in the middle, and at the end of their metabolic health in terms of blood levels, their weight, their waist, and also cognition tests and depression scales and that kind of thing. So we want to formalize this knowledge that so many clinicians already have, that these things seem to improve, and we want to test it rigorously in an academic setting. And so I first got in touch with Mike Browning, who's the professor at Oxford, who I'm doing this with early last year, maybe late 2022. And I think it was early last year, he'd been to Chicago at a conference and seen Ian Campbell from Edinburgh talk about his study on keto for bipolar disorder, got interested in the area. And when I got in touch, he was very keen to work together on this. So we're really excited. The control group is going to be coached by a dietitian on the kind of Eat Well guide, which is in the UK, the sort of healthy whole grains type advice that people get as standard. And that'll be the kind of control to see how they do versus the intervention group. So very fortunate that the Bazooki group have agreed to partially pay for the study, and we're crowdfunding this summer for it. And Bazooki group are going to match the crowdfunding. So
Mm-hmm.
for the first £10,000 or 10,000, £10,000 that we raise, they're going to match that. And yeah, we want to start the study in about a year. And so anyone who wants to donate, that would be a really amazing way to kind of feel connected to this science and to make it happen, so that we can get this out into further studies, doctor surgeries, and in people's hands to help them take control, and help work with their clinicians to improve their mental health. And we started with ADHD and depression because that was my issue.
Mm-hmm.
And then we think that the root cause will join up with other mental disorders, and that we'd be able to use MetPsy for all of these different mental disorders, like we have already with the coaching we've done on the site. So we're really excited about it. And in the meantime, what we plan to do as well is find people who have access to an Oura ring and a continuous glucose monitor, and offer their data to us. So if they have ADHD and they have these wearables and they want to pay to play, if you like, to get involved with something similar to the Oxford study, then they can offer their data to us. And that way we can have a kind of citizen science version of the Oxford study that brings in more data. So it's a grand plan over the next 6 to 12 months.
Okay, right. And it's a really good idea to use crowdfunding to get some money in. How much do you need? I don't know how much a study like this would cost. It's not cheap anyway. So
Yeah, so to make sure the study happens, we need about 30,000
mm,
pounds. So that
okay,
means
that's doable, I think.
exactly that means that we can
Yeah.
afford uh, the dietitian for the control arm and to pay the participants. And the main cost is testing. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what people want to know ultimately is, did the people get better? And you need to test for that. And so that's what we'll be crowdfunding for. And if we beat the target, then we can start looking at more tests that will tell us even more about the people's health and getting more participants into the study to make the statistics stronger. So hopefully with everyone's help and the Bazooki Group's support, we can hit that target.
Yeah, that's great. So I will definitely link to the crowdfunding website in the show notes, and we will make sure that everyone who listens or watches the video is knows where to click and where to put their money, because I think it's a really, really great study and it's so much needed. And as you mentioned in the beginning, the studies on nutrition are difficult to do, and most of the time they are quite expensive, and in the end there is nothing you can patent. So that's a big problem with nutritional studies, but I think that's the way to go, and it's wonderful to see some people who are motivated and passionate about the idea and the health outcomes we can see with a ketogenic diet, and to do those studies and to put the work in. And yeah, thank you for that. Is there anything else you want to mention I forgot to ask about, or you feel we should definitely talk about?
No, I think that was a really great discussion, great questions, and thanks for having me on. I can tell you that the link for the crowdfund is bit.ly/ADHD keto. So that's bit.ly/ADHD keto. And I will be putting up a video to explain the crowdfunding campaign on the page in the next few days. So, but by the time this goes out, I think people will be able to see the video and see a bit about Mike Browning and more about the study. But yeah, until then, I guess people can go to metpsy.com as well and check out what we're doing. But I really appreciate you having me on. It's been a great chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to the study, and I'm really, really hoping you're getting the money, but I'm sure you will, because there are a lot of people out there who want to support studies like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.